Hey guys, Chris here. Tonight we have a story about a teenager who's in the Sierra Nevada here who finds something very frightening but astounding in the snow. Plus we have 2 other stories, so 3 total. That's next. Okay guys, I am in the Sierra Nevada tonight. It is a beautiful night, blue skies, it's summer, no wind, and the bugs are nil. And so for tonight's beer, speaking of summer, we have Sierra Nevada Summerfest, and that is a refreshing summer lager, not lager like cut down a tree, but lager like drink a beer. And that is the purest ingredients, finest quality. Family owned, operated, and argued over. Not sure what they're arguing about, but apparently there's a family dispute. Little dust in there, but there we go. Oh, look at the very light, almost whitish color. That looks, oh, I can smell it already. Almost as citrusy. I'm gonna take it straight out of the can. That's from Chico, California. And they've had some fires recently, so. That is, wow, I haven't had this before. That is really tasty. It's got almost a champagne finish to it. Real tasty, a little bit of fruitiness to it. Alcohol is 5.0 ABV, and yeah, real tasty. Summerfest. Cheers. So our story takes place in 1978. 13-year-old Tyler was living with his aunt and uncle, and they were living outside of Eerie, California, which is on the other side of the mountains here, literally that way. They're in Calaveras County, and Calaveras County is within the Stanislaus National Forest, very large national forest, 898,000 acres of wild country, mountains, pine trees, water, lakes. And also there's Calaveras Big Tree State Park, which has sequoias and redwoods. I've actually been there before. Wonderful park. I've done a video there, and I'll post it in the description below. I did this years ago. The aunt and uncle had a good sized property outside of town, and they had a small building, and then there was this hill. It went down to this creek, and there was a bridge that went across the creek and then up this slope, and that's where they built this cabin, and they were in the state of construction. They had plastic over the windows to keep the cold out. Even the front door was 2x4s put together in a configuration and then covered with plastic. And this story takes place in winter of 1978, and they had a wood stove, and that's where Tyler was staying, and he'd come there for several summers and decided to come just after Christmas to see his aunt and uncle. So one night, Tyler was going to sleep downstairs on the couch. It had snowed earlier that day, about 10 inches. Tyler had his sleeping bag, the wood stove was going, the 2 dogs that they had were lying next to the wood stove on their little beds. Aunt and uncle were upstairs in the bedroom. Tyler was having a hard time sleeping. He was shivering, it was really cold. He was close enough to the wood stove, it helped, but it was still really cold for him. About 30 minutes after he was lying down, he was having a hard time sleeping, he heard some movement outside the cabin. Again, there was plastic over the windows and the front door. He's thinking, did I just hear what I thought I heard? And then he thought about it, and he didn't hear anything, and then he heard it again, and it started walking around the cabin. First on this side, then in the front, then he could hear it on the other side. And he was really spooked by this. Could kind of hear it faint in this side of the cabin, and then it came back around this side. Immediately, the two dogs were agitated. They sat up, they're turning their heads, looking, and then they both began to growl. This was not normal for these two dogs. They were very mild, very friendly dogs, and they just had this wild, kind of angry feel to them. And it was really felt weird for Tyler to see this. And he didn't want to look out the window because he was afraid that whatever it was could just be right there. And he felt really vulnerable because the plastic on the windows was no way to secure the cabin. The dogs both got up and they started pacing back and forth between the door and the window and then the other side of the house, the cabin. And this pacing went on for about 15 minutes. You could hear this walking, bipedal footsteps walking around the cabin. After 15 minutes, it just stopped. And the dogs sat up for a few more minutes by the window and the door, and then they returned to their beds and laid down again. And then Tyler was sitting there, kind of shaken up by this. And he was too afraid to get up and go upstairs, too afraid to look out the window. And so he just laid there for a couple hours until he fell asleep. So Tyler woke up early the next morning, about 6:30. And he's laying in a sleeping bag just for a moment. And he's kind of questioning reality, like what happened the night before, because it was very frightening for him to have something just outside the cabin that was really large, walking around, lurking around, and probably watching him. And that would change once he went outside and saw what he saw. So a couple minutes later, he gets up to let the dogs out and go out with them. Goes down the steps of the cabin. Dogs are running, and he's heading down the slope, and he sees right away some tracks coming from the right side of the cabin. And he can see these tracks going down towards the creek, across the creek, around this stand of trees, and then behind there. And so he starts walking down the slope, and he can see the tracks go right to the creek, and then it looked like whatever it was jumped over this creek that was 6 or 7 feet wide. Goes across the bridge, and he walks over to these tracks, and now he's looking at them, and to his amazement, they're about 15 inches long, 5 toes, very human-like, humanoid is what he called them, and very wide. He said the stride was 6 to 7 feet between footprints. So he's off to the side of these tracks, and he's now following them down the creek and around this stand of trees, and he comes to a fence, and he can see that this thing easily stepped over this fence. And the fence divided the private property that they owned from the national forest. And he looked carefully, and he could see there was a left footprint on this side of the fence, and then a right footprint on the other side of the fence. And he said the fence was 4.5 feet tall. It came up to his chest. He was 13 years old. He followed the fence line, and then he looked and could see the tracks continue, and they went down further into this valley and disappeared into this meadow and through the trees off in the distance. He stopped following him at the fence line. He was blown away, and he realized that whatever that made these tracks was outside the cabin the night before. So he comes back to the cabin, and sure enough, he walks around the side, and he can see the tracks going around the cabin, and it looked like 2 or 3 times. It was hard to tell. There was multiple tracks though. And at one point he saw the sawhorses that had 2x4s laying on them, and a couple of the 2x4s were on the ground. like whatever it was, maybe picked up the 2x4s and just dropped them or something. He didn't hear anything. But it was daytime and the sun was out, and so he was kind of excited about what he had found. So he immediately goes back into the cabin, goes upstairs, knocks on the door of the aunt and uncle who were still asleep, and he said, "Hey, I found something pretty amazing outside, some tracks, some really large tracks." And they didn't apparently really know what he was talking about, and they didn't want to get all bundled up and get up early and go, so they didn't come outside. And he was really disappointed because there was no one else to see this discovery. Later that morning, the snow came back in and covered up the tracks. And so, as far as he knew, nobody would believe him. Turns out later, on other trips to this cabin, he started talking to people in the area and friends, just a few close friends, and told them what he had found, and they had their own stories around Eerie, California. And I've heard other stories from this area. It's a pretty wild area. And one of the stories that people had, that Tyler heard a few times, was that people would be driving at night down the highway or one of the back roads, and they would hear what they thought was a siren, a loud siren outside their vehicle, and they would pull over and they would just sit there in the darkness, and there would be no police that would come by, and they wouldn't hear anything or see any lights or anything. He heard that story a few times from other people. He also heard stories that from people that he talked to, that they heard howls and strange screams. Nobody had seen tracks like he had seen and heard anything outside their cabin, but they heard things way off in the distance and had other experiences. And this was our story from Tyler from Eerie, California in 1978. He also mentioned over the years he really didn't talk about this much because he didn't want to be embarrassed or humiliated and people not believing him, so he just kind of kept it to himself, except for the kind of the locals that he trusted. And then he saw some things on Finding Bigfoot and some other shows, and they talked about that area in that time period, late 70s, early 80s, and there was some stories that were on this program that he saw. All right. We got to head to a new location for the next story, so let's go. Okay, so I am sitting along a nice little stream here, and for my next drink, we have South Park Sarsaparilla. It says all natural, small batch, made with cane sugar. It's sarsaparilla, and it's got a Sasquatch on it. It's perfect. It looks like an old beer bottle or something, but that'd be kind of fun to do that. So there we go. I'm gonna just take it right out of the bottle here. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Oh, that is straight out of the creek. Put it in the creek, iced it up, and that is really tasty. It's not overly sweet, which is nice, but it's got that kind of refreshing cola-ish, almost a root beer kind of flavor to it, but it's sarsaparilla from the Rocky Mountain Soda Company. That's great. So, all right, cheers. So this story was sent to us in an email by one of our viewers. His name is Steve. He sent this a while ago. And this took place in 1980, just a couple years after the previous story. This took place near Sandgate, Vermont. And there is where Steve and his family had this cabin at that time. And this cabin was used throughout the year, holidays, as well as skiing. And that winter, just after Christmas, between Christmas and the New Year, he and his brother, his two sisters and his cousin were skiing at a local ski area outside of Sandgate, Vermont. They were all done for the day. They were heading back to the cabin, and his two sisters and cousins said, "Hey, we're really hungry. We're going to stop at the restaurant, get something to eat before we get to the cabin." And Steve and his older brother, he was 22, Steve was 16. His older brother and Steve said, "You know what, we're just going to head back to the cabin. It's been a long day and we had something late to eat at the chalet." So they went back to the cabin. Two sisters and cousin went to the restaurant, and they pull up this long driveway to this cabin. It's pretty cold. There's like 5 degrees. This cabin is situated with forest all the way around, pretty remote, and there's a small mountain behind it. Steve and his older brother get out of the car. They go up to the front door of the cabin, and then they realize the door is locked and they don't have the key. His sister does. So right then, his older brother starts taking his shoulder. He's just about to ram into the door and kind of break the door jamb open. And Steve says, no, stop. Dad is going to be really ticked off if we do that, so don't do that. Why don't we just go wait in the car? They should be here shortly. Steve's older brother really didn't want to do that, but all right, let's do that. It makes sense. So they go back in the car, close it up, and it's pretty cold in there, and it's like 5 degrees, like I said. And they got the motor off because there's still some heat from when they drove up. And they're sitting there, and they're starting to fall asleep, just kind of sitting there, just waiting. Not really happy, but they hear this really loud, prolonged yell, howl, scream from the mountain behind the cabin. And Steve said it was directed at them. And I don't know how he meant that, but what he probably meant was it wasn't some far off thing. It just, the sound was so powerful, it just felt like it was directed right at them. And they both knew the outdoors and nature and what mountain lions sound like and bears and even owls. And Steve said it was none of those. Absolutely none of those. This howl, yell, scream went on for 12, almost 15 seconds. Steve looks over at his brother and he says, "Did you hear that?" And he just nodded his head. He didn't say anything. They're sitting in the car feeling pretty vulnerable. 30, 40 seconds goes by, and they hear this loud howl, scream, yell again. This time even louder. Right behind the cabin, and again it was directed at them. And Steve said it sounded almost angry, and like it wanted them to go away. After the second one, Steve's brother immediately opens up the door, slams the car door, and marches right to the front of the cabin, takes the door, turns the knob, and then shoulders it twice, and then the third time just pops it open, breaks the door jamb, and wood kind of splinters onto the ground. And Steve is still sitting in the car, and he gets out of the car, shuts the door, and as he's walking towards the cabin, he hears this howl, scream, yell again. This time it's on the ridge, and it's a little bit farther away. He walks up, it's just about to get inside the cabin. He hears it a fourth time. And he said on the fourth time, it was farther down the ridge, but it kind of had this really eerie echo, this small to loud, and then it just kind of echoed through the forest. He walks in, and his brother is down on his hands and knees picking up the pieces, and then he said, "Did you hear this third and fourth howl?" And his brother just said no. And Steve knew he had heard it, and he was shaken up. They were both really shaken up by this, and they were just glad to be inside the cabin. and knowing that the sound seemed to be moving away. Turns out his brother fixed the door jamb with some glue and some small nails. When the sisters arrived with the cousin, he couldn't quite remember, but he was pretty sure he didn't mention anything to them about what they had heard. The rest of the trip, they skied and they came back to the cabin. They just sat by the fireplace, and he said they drank Molson's Golden beer and just kind of stayed in the cabin and relaxed, but always remembered that horrible howl, scream, yell, and it lasted so long, and it was just behind the cabin. And he had heard, kind of like the previous story, years later, that there was other stories about that area, Whitehall, New York, Sandgate, Vermont, and that forested area, of stories of Bigfoot and Sasquatch around that time period. And that is our story from Steve, who emailed me. And we're going to get on to the next location now before the sun goes down. Fortunately, I have my new Energizer light here that we'll be using to keep me well lit. So, all right, let's go. Okay, you guys, I'm in the back of the truck. I'm next to this really large meadow. Beautiful view of the Carson Pass area this way. And my next drink is just simply going to be some water. So that's all we need at this point. And we got the nice REI container there. Oh, there we go. That's all we need. So I wanted to show you guys just my light setup. Since the sun's going down, it's going to be dark in a few minutes here. I got a nice spotlight here. This is Year Blue is what it's called. Amazon. Just very compact spotlight. A couple different light settings on it. And then this, there we go. And then this, you can set it up with this little stand like this to, if you're working on a tent or something, or set it up like that. So that's a nice thing to have. It's just really handy, especially if you see something, hear something in the woods, and now you got a direct shot of it. Also got the headlight. You got to have a headlight. This is the Fenix 65 RT. This has two headlights on it, two lights, and 3 settings each light. Very bright, 1500 lumens though. And then this side lightens up, brightens up. Look at that. Isn't that awesome? But nice to have a headlight, keep your hands free, especially for cooking. And then, as like I said, we got the Energizer. This is rechargeable, little charger USB, and the cable plug-in right there. Very bright. This has got 3 settings. This one, very bright. 1,000 lumens on this, but it's 360 with water resistance to it, not waterproof. But, and then we got like that, and then this really low setting, like for in the tent, so everyone else is sleeping, you can maneuver around and not trip over somebody and go crashing through the tent or something. So that is my light setup, at least for tonight. Okay, so this story comes to us from Kathy. She sent me an email a while ago, and her husband Charles. They currently live in Appalachia on a small tree farm, is what she told me, and they've lived on this, their family, for many generations, for over 200 years. They love wildlife. They love going into the woods at night looking for wildlife. And they've seen mountain lions, bobcats, and black bears, as well as other animals at night. And they would get on their quads and drive into various locations, swamps, thick forests, and just go listen and watch and sit in the dark and see what they can find. It's pretty wild. And as you know, most wildlife, a lot of wildlife is very nocturnal. And in fact, I had a story, and I won't go into it, but I was camping and a bobcat came up and circled my tent, and it turned out they travel 4 or 5 miles on a very specific route hunting every night. And then they kind of sleep during the day, so I understand what they were trying to do. So this took place in the year 2000 in North Carolina. Eastern North Carolina, they were working over there, living in this area, and it was near the Big Raft Swamp. And there's some history with this swamp. A lot of it is in private ownership. It was never turned into a preserve, but there's some Civil War history as well as Revolutionary War history. This Big Raft Swamp also has a lot of wildlife, but a lot of vegetation, giant cypress trees, creeks and marsh and swamp, and very beautiful and yet very frightening at the same time if you were to be in there after dark. And it's really hard to navigate in a swamp. And part of the swamp was divided up into canals in the old days and jeep trails. And so they could take their quads and drive back, and they knew the locations and the area really well. So they would go back there at night with their dogs and listen for wildlife. And so in 2000, they took their dogs. Kathy said these dogs, there was 4 of them, were Labradoodles. They just loved these dogs. They made great guard dogs and great pets. Kiba treed a would-be robber. And this robber, this poor guy, was up in this tree, and he yelled, "Could you please get your dog?" so he could get down. And there was a failed home invasion thanks to Trixie, the Labradoodle. She didn't give any details on what the story was, but that's what she said. And her point was these dogs were fearless, and they would go with them on these night journeys into the swamp and the forest looking for wildlife. Kathy also mentioned that Thelma and Millard had survived a battle with an alligator. These dogs were fearless, or so she thought. And that particular night, they got in their quads, Charles and Kathy and their son, and they knew the route through the forest, and they're out in the swamp, and they're on this kind of a peninsula, and there's swamp all around, and there's a picnic table there. And right away, they heard this slogging and this sloshing in the darkness in the swamp. And immediately, the dogs moved behind them and were silent. And Kathy and Charles weren't afraid at this point. And Charles had this habit of doing this BIGFOOT call in the night in the swamp and seeing what kind of response they got. And usually what would happen is the sound, if they heard something, would move in the opposite direction. And this time, out of the swamp came this large stick, like a small tree branch, came flying out of the swamp 20 feet across this canal and landed 5 feet in front of the picnic table they were standing next to, and it didn't hit the dogs or them. The dogs stayed silent and didn't move. Both Kathy and Charles at this point were filled with fear because they knew this was totally something different. Charles kind of fumbled around and he pulled out this small flashlight and he shined it in the direction where this large stick had come flying out of the swamp. Immediately he sees these large yellow eyes, not blinking, not turning, just staring back at them. And they were about 8 feet off the ground. And there was no tree immediately right there. Just these eyes staring back at them. Whatever this was 8 to 9 feet tall. Kathy was frozen with fear. She couldn't move. Their son sat quietly. Charles immediately turned the flashlight off, and this seemed to have spooked whatever this was in the swamp, because they could hear it sloshing and slogging and starting to move away, and it was very large. It seemed like forever. It was a couple of minutes, and then their dog Millard moved down the little slope into the canal and swam across. Disappeared in the darkness. They could hear him come up on the other side, and he went farther away, and he started barking at whatever this was. Charles turned to Kathy and said, "We need to leave now." The family got up and started quietly and quickly moving, and thankfully Millard came back. They could hear him jump into the canal and start swimming back across. They waited for him. He came up, and he was wagging his tail and acting like he had done something really brave. Obviously, whatever this was moving away, so the dog probably felt he had something to do with that. They never go back into the forest at night to watch the stars or listen to wildlife without their Glock. They never really talk about this outside of their immediate family, not even with neighbors. It's just something they don't do. Kathy said she was really struck by how similar her story was and just how it felt by watching and hearing other stories on this channel, on my channel on YouTube here. Nothing else happened to them, no other strangeness in the swamp, but she said this has not affected her or Charles or her son like it has other people that she's heard about on my channel and other places. But it was really a strange and frightening moment in their lives that they had on that night in the Big Raft Swamp with their dogs. So that is our story from Kathy and Charles from North Carolina. Thank you, you guys. Pretty crazy story. The swamp thing coming out at night and seeing the eyes and everything. So, all right, you guys. Fortunately for me, I don't have a long hike back to my truck because I'm in the truck right here. So this is great. It's fun sitting in the back of the truck. I've been wanting to do this. And it is pitch black around me. I got this moon over here, about a half a moon. Other than that, it is pitch black. Now, we do have a few stars out, but it's really hard to pick up with the camera. So, all right, you guys. Well, thank you for watching. As always, I appreciate all your comments and just hearing from you guys. It's really great. And we're going to keep this going, and we're going to be camping again soon. I'm going to camp a couple times a month and then do stories as usual, but always having the stories. So, all right, thanks, you guys. We'll see you next time. As always, keep hiking.